Dakle, dobro večer. Dobro večer i dobrodošli na razgovor u sklopu Human Rights Film Festivala pod naslovom Hannah Arendt Misliti zlo. Prije nego što pređemo na samu diskusiju, tehnički detalj koji možda neki od vas ne znaju, diskusija će biti na engleskom, bez prevođenja. To nije na plakatima, vidim kicovim naglašeno, nadam se da ipak neće smetati. S nama su danas Tomas Kinan, Vesna Kesić i Tonči Valentić. Ne znam do koje mjere je potrebno zapravo ih predstavljati, ja ću u nekom trenutku kada im dam riječ možda ipak reći nekoliko riječi o svakome od njih. So, let's start with the youngest one, Tonči Valentić, philosopher, cultural worker, cultural writer, publicist, organizer, one of the most prominent members of so-called younger generation of our intellectual life. To start with a slightly broader topic, there is a recent trend in the field of making movies, and that recently some of the good movies and a lot of movies have philosophy as a topic, and even more. Some of directors, let's say Godard in his film Socialism, have philosophers as main characters in it. Can you say something about this trend?
Dobro večer, thank you for this introduction. As being the youngest one here, my duty is to give a short introduction or overview on the trend of movies about philosophers or philosophical movies. But I would like to first preliminary to sketch that there are two major differences. First, we are speaking about the philosophical movies, as you mentioned, Godard and the authors and directors who deal with philosophical subject topics. And on the other hand, there are movies about philosophers. So there is a first distinction I would like to pinpoint. The other one is the distinction between feature films and documentaries. Because as you all know, I suppose that documentary genre is more suitable for this kind of presented philosophers, because feature films seldom have been shot or made on the lives of philosophers, and the movie that we had the opportunity to see, the movie about Hannah Arendt, is the feature one. So it's not a documentary, although it has some elements of documentary incorporated into it. I would like to say that having those two distinctions in mind, focus on about philosophers could be summarized about preliminary documentaries about philosophers, which started with, let's say, Foucault, and then Deleuze has some television shows and interviews, and also Chomsky, and to mention some other authors like I know, after Deleuze, it's I think the most prominent Zizek, and after the famous or infamous, as you like it, documentary Zizek, and the next one, Perfect Guide to Cinema, and the one which is supposed to be broadcasted solely, the Perfect Guide to Ideology. Philosophy suddenly started to occupy the space of film and cinema. But I have a problem here. The main problem is that those movies practically do not thematize or analyze the most important aspects of philosophical work. I mean, this is the difference between documentaries and feature films. And in Margareta von Trotta film, we have a clear story about a German philosopher of Jewish origin, Hannah Arendh, focused only, the movie is focused only about a couple of years that she spent being in Israel, and after that writing a report which then caused a huge scandal. And of course this is kind of a story which is very suitable for a feature film. And it's also kind of an engaged story. So in that sense, I think that looking upon the movie, I would say it's a good one. It's kind of exception because it's a feature one. And on the third part, there is a thing that should be in a way explained, that the notion, the very notion of so-called banality of evil, which is today became almost a cliche, something which is commonly used in philosophical debates in the theater and in literature theory and in many different disciplines, was half a century ago very controversial and scandalous even. So the movie precisely and very nicely depicts how the controversial debate has grown during these years, but she was actually writing for the magazine and later published the famous Haifa in Jerusalem book. So I think I'll stop here. I'll just say that to put the notion that many German philosophers have emigrated to the United States after the war or during the war, and Hannah Arendt was one of them. And it's interesting that among many of those philosophers and theoreticians and authors and artists, there are no basically films or documents, whatever, take an example of Adorno, take the example of the writers like Thomas Mann, and you don't have really interesting stories and be it documentary or feature film genre that depict its context. So I'll stop here and follow this.
Okay, thank you. Our next guest is Vesna Kesić, public figure, writer, journalist, theoretician, activist, you name it. Vesna has, she told me that she had an opportunity or privilege, whatever you like, many years ago to make an interview with Margareta von Trotta. And when we tried to speak about what should be the topic tonight, we came to the interesting conclusion that Vesna is somehow a person who can connect Margareta von Trotta, her opus from particularly Rosa Luxemburg movie about Rosa Luxemburg, of course, which also starred Barbara Sukova, who played the role of Hannah Arendt in the latest Margareta movie. So can you say something about how you think about differences between those two movies, how you see, I wouldn't say development, but changes in portrayal of women heroines in Margareta von Trotta, and anything else you might like to say connecting with Margareta von Trotta and Hannah Arendt.
Yeah, but how to, is it on? Yeah. Okay, thanks. Thank you for the introduction. Everything but theoretician. As Arendh would say, everything but philosopher also. She was, of course, trained in philosophy. Yeah, I had this privilege to make this interview with Margareta von Trotta at the time when I think we only saw the Gladden effects, the English title, the Orna Bremena. and the movies she made together with Schlendorf, which was the lost owner of Katharina Blum, and she also worked with him on this a very dark movie, Coup de Grâce. But to tell you the truth, I really remember a little about what she told me in that interview that was so many years ago. I'm much more under the impression of this movie that we saw yesterday, and in a way I can try to connect it to Rosa Luxemburg, which I had just recently a chance to see on some promo DVD, so it was maybe not the best medium. What connects these movies, as almost every movie that Margarete von Trotta did, is of course that she is, through the medium of the movie, approaching important women. She sometimes calls them the strong women from kind of recent history. And it's almost inevitable that she sometimes comes to Hannah Arendt, same way as Julia Kristeva came to Hannah Arendt in her book, psychoanalytic book on female genius in the 20th century. What struck me here, like in all the others von Trotta's movies, is that she managed to do one thing. Maybe it's only my impression, not maybe being really the film critic or something, but of course this is a film about a philosopher, a public figure, a thinker, emigre, a woman, and everything. But this movie, I'm really interested that I agree, although it's the story about the philosopher and the woman, and it's squeezed and it's shortened, of course, and it's all put together, many different anecdotes. But in the poetics, I think what she's really trying to do is really to follow this basic research of Hannah Arendt in philosophy, in thinking, in understanding, and in, of course, explaining the political and public sphere and private sphere and all these particular spheres that Hannah Arendt actually thinks through and thinks about. And maybe in the contrast to the other films, like particularly Rosa Luxemburg, which tries to do exactly the same thing, of course, to talk about a heroine, but never to detach it from her personal experience and private life, because this is something what Arendh, of course, theorizes a lot. In this movie, I think she did it much better than with Rosa Luxemburg. Although it's a well-known thing that Rosa Luxemburg, that was made in '86 or something, rather long ago, was nominated for many Oscars and European Film Awards. I don't remember which one she won. But in this movie, it seems to me that, let me first make small digression to difference that I see in those films. They cannot be very different than the way the Margaret von Trotta does movies, of course. But at the first sight, Rosa Luxemburg, as one of the, of course, the most inspiring female heroine in a revolutionary thinking and acting, the whole movie is done in a very bright colors. It's all light, you know. Even when she talks about her personal experience, her love affairs with Leo Jović's, with other lovers and so on, she's almost all the time in the movie exposed to the very bright light. While here now, with Hannah Arendt, we have this switch to the change of the light, how the scene and the color is written, that really, of course, when Arendh is out in public, we have the white picture and takes. When she's inside, they are very often much darker, and then when Margarete von Trotta tries to depict that she's thinking, the picture is even more darker. And I think that she really succeeded, and this is the most interesting thing about this movie, to somehow translate the basic Hannah Arendt's structure of the world, this rigid division between private and public, and then the questionable place of the social sphere. I hope everybody knows what am I talking about. If not, we can go through that later on. But that she's really somehow managing to do that. And although I do take seriously some objections, I heard yesterday that, of course, this is the movie with too much talking, too much lines, and who really doesn't know her writing, maybe cannot follow these things. But now I would really call in Hannah in the line that Sukova tells in the movie, well, if they don't know, they should learn. I mean, it sounds a little bit elitistic, but this is also something that Hannah Arendt was always integrating in her way of thinking, speaking, and addressing the public. So this is one of the reasons why I like this film better, even if it's just a very personal impression. The other thing which is very important and has something to do from Trotta, but also with Arendh, although you wouldn't find it in her theoretical writing, but you would find it in her public communication or private letters that were later published, or in her interviews, which were rare. She was not easy to go and speak publicly, but as many of her biographers or people who were studying her life noticed, she's actually saving every little paper, every little note she made, every concept of a book or of an essay, and it's all now being in a library of the Congress or on the Bard College where Arendh Blicher worked. When you put all that together in some biographies that I read, and I had the privilege to take my MA at the new school where she was teaching, and there was lots of her pupils actually, or doctorate studies, so I met some of these people who really know her and probably had this privilege to find out something. Margaret von Trotta, of course, calls herself a feminist filmmaker, makes movies about women and tries to make them in a way like a woman with the experience of woman would understand another woman. It may be a particular approach, it may be a limited approach, it doesn't necessarily brings us to the universal to which Hannah Arendt strains so much, but which also leaves lots of controversies in her life and writing. But this film is trying to show this, this connectedness of the experience and the thought, including the episode with Eichmann, which is very, very interesting, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it, what it meant for herself, for her intellectual structure, and for her future writing. So von Trotta is really approaching her through that, through the private sphere, trying to depict and to show the importance of the intimacy, which is even farther out from the private, of course, something Arendh will probably never talk about publicly. Although, of course, we later find her letters to Heidegger and his to her, and so on and so on. But, this is what I find interesting. Well, the movie about Rosa Luxemburg still looks to me much more as a poster or as a cartoon or as a demonstration of political radicalism, although it also has this personal Rosa's experience built into it. That much so far.
Okay, thank you. And our third guest is Thomas Keenan, who teaches literary theory and human rights at Bard College. He is also leading a human rights project there. One of his latest projects is a book, Mengeles' Skull, written with A.L. Weizmann from Goldsmiths College in London. And I think it would be nice to say, because you are working with Weizmann and you are working with all these nice people at Goldsmiths. Can you say something about relationship of this movie and movie by Eyal Sivan, the specialist? We had a chance to host him and his movies a few years ago here also. Tell us something about this creation and perception and interpretation of this new type of criminals, new type of court processes, which basically started with the Eichmann trial.
Thank you. Yeah, so you've seen, maybe many of you have seen, Sivan and Braumann's film, The Specialist, or A Specialist, which very much adopts Arendt's interpretation of the trial. It's a film in homage, in a way, to her interpretation, and it pays particular attention to this notion of what we could call the administrative crime, or the bureaucratic mass murder. And it does it by recutting, re-editing, reframing the footage from the Eichmann trial itself in a way that underlines and emphasizes Arendt's interpretation. This is different, obviously, because it tells the story not only of the trial, but of the Von Tratte movie. I mean, it's different because it tells the story not only of the trial, but of the controversy about Arendt's interpretation, which Sivan's film more or less simply endorses. So I thought maybe I should say a little bit about what that interpretation is here. The first thing to say, which is reflected not so strongly in the Von Tratte film, and maybe more so in Sivan and Braumann's film, is that the trial itself was a film. It was the first trial that was filmed on television film in its entirety, from beginning to end. So in a certain sense, it was the first TV trial. That footage was lost very quickly and ultimately refound by Sivan and restored. But the trial was understood from its beginning. The very conception of the trial was as a public project, a public lesson for the new, or the second generation Israeli state. And I think that comes up at various moments, but not so prominently in Von Tratte's film. It comes up at one decisive moment, though, which I thought was interesting. In general, I thought that the interpretation of this film of Arendt's book was remarkably, I don't know what the right word is, accurate, correct. It was very faithful and serious interpretation. So the first point would be that Arendth was very critical of the way in which the trial verged on being a show trial. And coming out of her analysis of totalitarianism, the idea that a totalitarian criminal would be put on trial in a show trial was particularly aggravating or irritating to her. So at one point in the film, she gives a little lecture on what a trial ought to be, what a juridical proceeding ought to be. It's much more richly explained in the book. But the idea is that whenever a state puts a person on trial, it enters into a fundamental compact, fundamental ethical agreement, implicit as it is, but a fundamental one, that the only thing that's on trial is the person who's being put on trial, and that the question for the court to determine is whether he or she has committed the acts that they're charged with or not. And that simple understanding, that very primal understanding of the trial as a machine for producing a verdict of guilt or innocence about the person on trial, she feels was put in jeopardy by the Eichmann trial. by the aspiration of the state and the prosecutor to use this as a nation-building exercise, to use it as a history lesson, to use it as a cathartic re-empowerment of survivors who happen to be in Israel. She was very critical of it. I think that's only loosely or lightly touched on in this film, but I think it's a very important one. And it turns partly around this notion that the trial was understood at its origin as a television production, as a media project. So that's the first. I'm not sure if it's entirely unprecedented, but the first novelty here. Second, about the crime or the criminal. So Arendh argued that the crime here, the attempt to erase an entire people from the face of the earth through administrative, technical, bureaucratic, industrial means was unprecedented, and that the criminal, in this case, the one criminal who she's paying attention to here, his relation to it was also unprecedented because, in a certain sense, he didn't mean to do it in the classic sense. He only meant to do what his job was, and it was disconnected from an idea or from an intention, a criminal intention, in the classic sense that criminal law understands what it tries as intention. You don't simply try acts, you try intentions, you try the state of mind, the mens rea of the criminal. And she found Eichmann's mens rea to be extremely hard to get at and maybe even absent. So in that sense, the criminal was an unusual one, and the crime that he committed, partly because of the mode, the non-intentional mode with which he approached the crime, was also novel or unprecedented. Third, the venue. So the book is called Eichmann in Jerusalem, and she underlines again and again, and the film is very attentive to this, that it happens in Jerusalem. It doesn't happen in Germany. And remember, at the beginning, there's that question of whether the Germans will ask to extradite Eichmann, and they don't. So it happens in Jerusalem, and it happens as part of this project of building a nation state, and as she sees it, of building what the kind of nation state that the Second World War and the Shoah ought to have put an end to, which is to say, an ethno-nationally oriented nation state. So she's very critical in the book of the charge, the most important charge against Eichmann, which is what the court called, what the indictment called, crimes against the Jewish people. And she argues for a different charge, which is to say crimes against humanity. She's willing to modify it as crimes against humanity committed on the body of the Jewish people, but she thinks it's very important to understand that the crimes were not, as she puts it, just another one in the ongoing and maybe endless repetition of pogroms and ethnically, religiously motivated murders. That it had a novelty in that it attempted to erase the entire group that it targeted. And in that sense, she says, it's a crime against not just the Jewish people, but against humanity. And she has a very novel interpretation of what humanity is, which is not an abstract, let's say, leveling out of everyone into something like everything else. But she says humanity is essentially, should be essentially understood as diversity, as different groups, different ethno or national groups, which are forced, as she says, to share the earth together. And Eichmann's crime for her was wishing not to share the earth with one of those groups. And in that sense, it was wishing something that runs counter to the fundamental understanding or fundamental definition of humanity. So in those are